So I'm Ted Hanlon. I'm here with Lisa Kinney and Mike Massey. And in this fireside chat with Lisa Kinney, we're going to talk about public lands. Lisa Kinney is a Democratic candidate for U.S. House of Representatives. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in Wyoming. I'm still in Wyoming. I was born in Laramie. I was in the Wyoming State Senate for 10 years. I'm also a librarian and an attorney and a volunteer and a businesswoman. So I have kind of a lot of things in my life that helped me decide I needed to run. Plus, I think that our country is in desperate need of people who are honest and want to represent Wyoming and not Washington. So that's kind of it.
So what is a fireside chat, and why did you decide to include them in your campaign?
Thanks. That's a great question. Fireside Chat started a long time ago with Franklin D. Roosevelt. And what he did is he took 30 minutes chatting with people on the radio in order to tell them the truth about what was going on in the world. And he did it between, believe it or not, 1933 and 1944. And what he wanted to do and what he did was he wanted to talk about complex governmental policies. He wanted to alleviate public panic during the Depression, and he wanted support for the war. Now, I think we're kind of in the same situation right now. We have a lot of complex governmental agencies and policies we need to explain. It's not the Great Depression, but I'll tell you what, people are stretching their money in order to survive. I think it's close to that. And we're in the middle of a war. So I thought, how can we approach a lot of very difficult issues except through what we're going to do? And the thing I liked best about his fireside chats, he always started every fireside chat with "my friends." And so, my friends, welcome to the fireside chat.
So I know you have a group of experts you're working with on a whole slate of complex issues that face the nation. And there's experts in different areas. I'd like you to tell us who's with us today and why you picked him to have a discussion today.
Well, again, a good question. What happened is that when I started to run, people said, get your 20 richest friends and have them give you money, and then you're on your own, except you have a lot of money. I thought, no, I'm going to get my 20 smartest friends because life is complex. What we're facing is complex. And so I was absolutely thrilled that Mike Massey, who's a former state senator from District 9 in Albany County, said he would be on public lands with us. He's on a BLM committee, and he can tell you more about himself. But I'll tell you what, thank you, Mike, for doing this. I think it's amazing for you to help us out. And again, the idea is to really educate people about what's going on with public lands and what we can do.
So Senator Massey, I know you're a historian. You've got quite a lot of experience in public lands. Can you tell us a little bit about being on the BLM committee and what that entails?
Sure, be glad to. And first of all, let me comment on the fact that Lisa had a list of 20, and I'm glad it was that large. I think I barely made it onto it. So it's good to be here. Being, of course, a Wyomingite for the last 47 years now, I understand how important public lands are, and I've been involved with them in many different ways over the years. Currently, I'm on the advisory board for the State Bureau of Land Management. And there for a while, we met regularly, quarterly, in order to offer advice to the BLM. The committee members come from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, industry, agriculture, from recreation, cultural resources. I said lots of different walks of life are represented on the committee. And together we offered advice to the State Bureau of Land Management, which is, of course, one of the largest agencies in administering our public lands here in Wyoming. Unfortunately, we haven't met since the current administration was inaugurated in January of last year. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that the advice that we were giving the BLM was quite important. just as our public lands are very important to the people who live here in Wyoming, and they've been an important part of American history and the American character for well over 150 years now.
So I've always thought that I had an answer to this question, but it'd be good to ask somebody that actually knows. How did this concept of public land develop 150 years ago, Mike? How did we end up with public lands at all?
Well, it comes with the notion of a frontier and how to pass the land on the frontier to settlers. And back east, that meant to settlers who were primarily farmers, who could farm the land. And back east, there's enough moisture for them to get 160 acres, which was provided by the various land laws at that time, in order to sustain a farm. But as you go further west, of course, the land becomes more arid. And as folks started arriving in western Nebraska and then eventually into Wyoming, they realized that, first of all, it's not a good place to grow a lot of crops. And the second thing they realized is that if they were going to do something that they were going to be able to survive in the land, it was going to require a lot more than 160 acres. So the Homestead Act was useful as far as staking out some land along stream. However, the rest of the land went unclaimed. That didn't mean it didn't go unused, especially with ranchers, but nevertheless, it went unclaimed. So as a result, when Wyoming became state in 1890, there was a great deal of public land here, unclaimed public land. So that helps explain why there's a great deal more public land in the West than there was back east. However, towards the end of the 19th century, Americans began to ask themselves an important question. They realized that most of their ancestors had come from Europe. But when they looked back at Europe as Americans, what they saw was an awful lot of war and famine and poverty and a social and economic structure that did not promote mobility. So they started asking themselves, how are we different than the Europeans? Is that us? Or have we become different since we moved over here to America? And so they began to identify some things that were unique to the United States in particular, but to America that was not part of the European experience. One of them was our lands, the monumentalism of our lands. A great deal of the works of Western painters and photographers began to circulate around the country, and people throughout the nation were in awe of the Western landscape in particular. And then they realized that those were public lands. So they began to identify with these public lands here in the West as part of what made them uniquely American, and therefore became part of the American character. And then historians at that particular time began to look at the settlement experience and the frontier as it slowly moved itself west over a period of time. But it was coming to a close around 1890. And they asked themselves, what are we going to lose once we lose the frontier? And many historians believed at that time that what we were going to lose was an important spirit of democracy, that each generation's attempt to settle the land to the West reinvigorated democracy. And as a result, with the closing of the frontier, they were concerned about what an impact it would have on our democratic institutions. So these two thoughts came together. And as a result, people began to look at the public lands differently, not as lands just to give away as quickly as possible, but as something to be preserved or conserved as part of the American character. And also that was a foundation to our system of representative democracy. And as a result, they started thinking, what are we going to do to preserve these lands and not just simply give them away? And along came the United States Forest Service, and then after that, the National Park Service, and then after that, the Bureau of Land Management. Wyoming was a critical part of this belief that our public lands was an important part of this nation's legacy and its future. We were the first state to have a national park. We were the first state to have a national forest and the first state to have a national monument. So as a result, to the American people, these public lands were part of their character. It was part of being an American. And out here in Wyoming is part of being a Wyoming, not only with regard to making a living, whether you're miners or ranchers or small business owners, but also to go out and hunt and camp and fish and photograph, and just to walk around at your leisure on our public lands. So that's the reason why public lands are such an important part of our lifestyle here in Wyoming, and is such an important part of the American spirit throughout this country.
Thank you so
That's
much. Lisa, why are public lands important to Wyomingites in your opinion?
Well, I thought, Mike, what you said is wonderful, because that is, public lands is everything to us. It's all around us. It's our recreation. It's our entertainment. It's why people come to visit us. And not only, you know, like you said, hiking and camping and fishing, we do a lot of things with public lands. And even though it's interesting, there are no big cities in Wyoming, but we still, even going from our little cities to go out and sit in our forests and breathe in the air and listen to the birds and listen to the animals, it really overpowers us and makes us feel like certainly Wyoming is, you know, our public lands are something we need to hold on to. We do not need to get rid of them. You know, and the other interesting thing is that Wyoming public lands are not only mountains and rivers and streams, but also, and you hear this, wide open spaces. My 5-year-old granddaughter just came from Massachusetts, and she looked around. She could not believe she could see miles and miles and miles and grasses and antelope and flowers, and she couldn't stop talking about it. It was, you know, if you know Massachusetts, it's full of trees. So this was a totally different experience for her. And you know, the other thing, one of my favorite drives is between Rawlins and Beaver Rim. You know, I love that. It has the wide open spaces and it has the mountains at the end. It's just wonderful. So I think we're very fortunate to be able to live where we are and to be able to take care of these wonderful spaces that are ours, and we don't want to give them away.
So that's what perplexes me a little bit, Lisa, and that is, you know, why is it that our current congressional delegation, as well as so many other people from Congress, are getting behind efforts to try to sell our public lands? They're so important to the people of Wyoming, regardless of what their political background is. They're part of our culture and our way of life here. So why aren't members of our delegation back there fighting for that?
Well, I'll tell you why, because they've become Washingtonized. They don't look at Wyoming for for our value. What has happened to all 3 of our representatives, and I think it might happen to anyone else who's elected that's not me, is that they listen to what they're being told to do. And one of the first mechanism or first things that the president said is, we're going to take public lands. We're going to do this. It was something that Harriet Hageman took to heart, especially Harriet. She's put in like 6 different bills. The first bill was try to take all of our public lands in 11 states. She did this with the senator from Utah, and except for Yellowstone National Park, and then sell it to private industry. I don't know what's happening to them. Somehow I think it has to do with money. It has to do with corruption. It has to do with forgetting who you represent. You know, and they represent us, our public lands. I don't know why they want to get rid of them. Harriet Hageman is doing it a lot, but you never hear a word from Lummis or Barrasso at all. They don't speak about Wyoming. Oh, wait a minute. They do speak about Wyoming. They speak about coal and oil and gas. And those are the 3 big words, and that's the only thing we hear. Not about what all of these getting rid of the public lands do to our animals, to our habitat, or to reduce our ability to go out and hunt, fish, or do any of the many other things that really make us a great population, make us love Wyoming. I don't know. There's something wrong there.
One of the stalking horse, particularly a favorite one, of Senator Lee from Utah, who introduced the bill to sell millions of acres of public land, is affordable housing. what he, of course, doesn't talk about, and what a lot of folks, unfortunately, don't understand, is that currently there are rules and regulations that the Bureau of Land Management has that permits them to transfer small sections of BLM land that are next to cities and towns that could be used for affordable housing. There's no need for additional federal legislation. There's no need for this excuse to sell millions of acres of public land in order to provide more affordable housing for our communities. We can do that right now. In fact, the advisory committee that I'm sitting on with the BLM, on the last meeting that we had, like I said, before the current administration was inaugurated, we talked about how the Wyoming BLM can help Wyoming communities with the affordable housing crunch that many of them are facing. And our next meeting, we were scheduled to meet with representatives from some of these small communities to talk about how the current rules and regulations that the Bureau of Land Management has can eventually result in the transfer of small sections of public land to these communities in order to help out with real affordable housing, not McMansions, but real affordable housing. And of course, it didn't go anywhere. So there's lots of excuses that these very creative minds are coming up with in order to try to convince people to let loose of their public lands. But I think that most of the people in Wyoming see through that, and they're not going to have it.
Well, Mike, the thing that you didn't mention, that was their second bill. The first bill was to remove everything except Yellowstone. Their second bill, and this was with Harriet Hageman, she introduced one in the House, while Lee introduced one in the Senate, and she called the land around Kemmerer and Jackson useless land that needed to be taken away so they could build housing. So she was right on that. And these both were supposed to go into the big, beautiful bill, and they both failed. So they continue to try and take things away, but she and he together are continually trying to get rid of our public land. So I don't know. I thought that was awfully interesting too. Why is she doing it? Why are they doing it? I don't know.
I think I can kind of see a pattern, if you give small tracts of land to ordinary people to build houses, oligarchs don't get to make any money. But if you sell millions of acres to an oligarch who then sells that land to other people, they get to make a lot of money. I think that's probably, the fundamental difference between the approach that Mike was taking and the approach that the new administration is taking.
Well, just real quickly, the other thing is what, Mike, you were working on. I've heard from a couple of people who are looking at that it can become more streamlined. And I think that's what you were going to do, is to make it a little bit easier, because we do in Kemmerer and we do in Jackson need housing. And if you can get some of that land around both of those cities that Harriet calls useless land, then it might really benefit the people who are needing housing at this point. But it's not useless. And if you can make it a better, an easier set of paperwork, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And they don't need a bill to do that. They could do that right
now. Yeah.
One of the things that we've talked since I was a little boy in Wyoming, we've talked about in terms of public land is multiple use. And I think I'm the poster child for multiple use, because we have a little ranch and it borders on Medicine Bow National Forest. So the first use I had of public lands was it was the biggest backyard a kid could ever have, right? So I used it for fun. But I've also grazed cattle on public land, and I was in the oil business in Wyoming for a long time. And I think every well I ever drilled was on public land. We had the permits to drill on public land, and so we were drilling for oil on public land. So there's a bunch of multiple uses that we already can use this land for. What's the biggest use of public lands in Wyoming?
Well, it's hunting, but I kind of want to go back to what you were just saying too. It's because my dad was a prospector. So I was in Rawlins with my family at age 3, looking for gold rare earths. I grew up with rare earths being in my basement, being developed by my dad. He had a company called Yttrium, and yttrium is one of the rare earths, and he found it throughout Wyoming. He was very good. It didn't bring him any money. In fact, it brought him a lot of grief. But you know, it's something now that's very valuable, and I think they're working on it. And so that's another thing is mining. You can mine for gold or prospect for gold and diamonds, and there are diamonds and rare earths, and that's another thing, along with shedding. Is that what it's called? Where animals drop off their antlers, and you can see what they've done in Jackson. They've made beautiful, you know, sheds. So people go out and look for that, and sometimes fossils. Anyway, there are many different things that you can do in Wyoming, along with what you were saying. And the biggest, going back to your question, the biggest use of public lands, it's the tourism is the second most popular industry, along with oil and gas, and then also agriculture. And within the public lands, hunting is the main issue, or the main thing that we do on public lands. I have a friend who goes out with bows and arrows September 1, tries to shoot the big game with that, and then if he doesn't get one, he goes back to guns, and all of that is perfect. It's another thing that you can do in Wyoming, but that's the number one use of our public lands, and that is to get out and, you know, as you know, and probably Mike knows, we have large populations of elk and mule deer and antelope and moose and black bears. You can shoot black bears and bighorn sheep, and even wild bison you can shoot in Jackson, which I didn't know. And also coyotes are considered a predator. So a lot, you could hunt those anytime you want, year round. It's fine. But for people who want to actually go and hunt, there's a lot to hunt. Some is edible and some is not. So I think that's the main thing we do on a public lands.
Is that what you found as well, Mike?
What's that?
Is that what you found as well? That hunting's I don't know, it's probably the thing most people do. Is it the biggest money maker for us on public land?
I don't know if it's the biggest moneymaker. It certainly supports an awful lot of small businesses, and supports the thorough enjoyment of being out there hunting by individuals and families and friends. What occurs to me is what you and Lisa had just described, in how you use public lands. Imagine if they weren't there, though, that everything you just described was not possible here in Wyoming, because a large private landowner has purchased it, someone who's very wealthy, probably doesn't even live in the state, and has decided to fence it off. And you can't do that anymore. And in fact, we don't have to imagine it very much. And the entire issue with regard to corner crossing on the lands on the southern part of the state, you know, out in the checkerboard area of the former, or of the railroad, in which private landowners, in this particular instance, someone from North Carolina, decided that they were just going to put up a fence and keep people from going from one section of public land to another, and just essentially walled them off until very recently. And some individuals decided to put it to challenge that in court, and so far they've won. And I can't remember for sure now that I think about whether that was from North Carolina, but someone who's very wealthy. So we see what would happen. We could see in the state today what would happen if suddenly the public lands were put on the auction block and sold to the highest bidder, whether a corporation or a wealthy individual. And they would just simply put up fences and say, public not welcome. So many of the things that you're talking about, and many of the things that people in Wyoming do besides that on public lands, would not be possible. And when you think about that not being possible, how does that affect, how does that undermine our notion of freedom here in Wyoming, for those of us who choose to live here in the state?
And that brings up a couple of other things. And I know you know about the helicopter, the hunters who decided there was a big piece of public land surrounded by private land, and they couldn't get in. There was no access allowed. So they hired a helicopter and they dropped the hunters off onto public land. They shot their bull, and then they had to get out to try and figure out how they could get the meat off the land. And when they came back, the owner of the private land was dragging the meat off onto his land. And so that also went into a suit. But here's the question. Why should we not have access to public land, even if it's surrounded by private land? So what we have to do is we've got to work on access, to get a law in there that says that all public land has to have access, even if it's through private domain, and encourage leases, but also then say, if all else fails, then eminent domain has to occur. It has to occur so that people might lose. If they're not willing to allow hunters to go into the public land, then you have to do something different. And I think, you know, these are areas that we need to look at congressionally.
Yeah, and of course, you brought up an issue that's a little bit different than a corner crossing, in which a person can go from one section of public land to another without trespassing on private land. And then there is the issue that folks who've had private land for a long time, and I mentioned there was, you know, back in the 19th century, some of our public land at that time was given through the Homestead Act to private individuals, especially along stream bottom. So sometimes those private lands that have been owned for a long time will prevent folks from getting the sections of public land that have become isolated over a number of years. And so two different issues here, and probably two different ways of approaching it.
Yeah, we just have to, both of those are important, but access is very important. And I think both you and I were talking about access. One is corner crossing, the other is private land surrounding public land. And it's just, we have to have, as long as we have public land, we have to have access to it, as well as it not being sold.
I understand there's several provisions in the 2027 budget bill that affect public lands. Lisa, can you tell us about those?
Yeah, they're constantly trying to, they being the federal government is constantly trying to cut back our lands, whether it's in the Big Beautiful Bill, and they tried it several ways in that and dealt with timber. But the most recent budget is cutting the BLM, and maybe this is why you haven't met Mike, by 34%, and the staff by 27%. And then the National Conservation Land is hit with a 76% cut. Also, and I think you heard about this, and I think it's called Buffalo Ridge, but they put 114,000 more acres in Wyoming, at least for oil and gas. And once you start leasing, all of these cause problems with habitat. And also, we haven't discussed water. I'm not sure. I think we may have to have another whole issue on public lands and water, and public lands and habitat and wildlife, and what really the problems are right now. If you look at all of our lakes, I just went through the state. Every river is down. You can't even call it a river. It's like streams throughout. Maybe, Mike, you have some information about that, but I think we need to get some water people in here, like maybe Larry Wolf, and have them talk to us about what's going on right now with our water drought, and how public lands and what you do with them will affect or will be affected because of this.
Yeah, I think that's certainly worthy of a conversation in of itself.
Yeah.
Water, of course, is the lifeblood of the West.
Yeah.
Especially that's always occurs in arid areas. And if nothing else, the West is arid for the most part. And the drought that we're going through, particularly here in Wyoming, is going to create a lot of hardships for a lot of entities. The people who live here, as well as the wildlife that occupy our land. And going back to the question with regard to probably the most important use of our public lands these days, I would put at the very top of that, like Just think how lonely we would be as Wyomingites if we didn't have all Wyoming.
Yeah, and you know, back east, when I'm thinking about, oh, sorry, when I'm thinking about my son who lives back there, people will go to areas, speaking of fenced off, that are fenced off public lands. So they'll have to go to a round park where they can experience public lands because there just isn't much back there, you know. So that's kind of how I see Wyoming in a way. If you sell everything off and just let little areas be public land and without access, you know, that's not good. And that's a problem.
I
If
have
they
one
do
last
what they want.
I have one last question for you, Lisa. We talked about Harriet Hageman and the bills she's introduced to take our public land. When you're elected, what bill are you going to introduce as far as public lands go?
Well, there is a bill that was introduced in January of 2025, and it's called Public Lands Belong, it's 417, Public Lands Belong to Public Hands, or should stay in public hands. There are two other sponsors to that bill, and I think we need to bring it up. It was introduced and has been sitting there ever since, and it's really an excellent bill, and it's something I want to look into and sponsor, and I think that's an important issue for me to be able to do. That's just one. There's so many things. We need to go back in the big, beautiful bill and get rid of all of the damaging effects that the big, beautiful bill has on public lands. It's terrible. It's full of it. And again, all of our representatives vote. Sorry about my phone. All the our representatives didn't say anything about these, and they're very painful to the state of Wyoming. And they didn't say a thing.
So for either one of you, any final thoughts before we end our first fireside chat?
I have one. And that is, here's the problem. The problem is we can talk about all of this, and we can talk about BLM, which is being cut. We can talk about what I could do, but if we continue to put in people who don't care about this, if I'm not elected, everything we're saying it doesn't matter. It's going to be more of the same. And I think we talked about that to begin with, is that all of the people who right now who are running in the GOP for the same position are asked and required to adopt the 80% of the Republican platform that Wyoming passed. So you have a small portion, all the people who are running in order to run, otherwise they would be forbidden to run. They have to say, I'm going to pass what's in Wyoming or what's in the Wyoming platform, Republican platform. And then you have 20% left, and that's where Washington comes in and tells you what to do. So as far as I can tell, I'm not sure there's going to be any independent thinking at all. And so I really have to be elected, and Jim has to be elected too. We have to make changes. We have to take a different path right now. And that's making changes in our public representative or our public elections. So thank you. Thank you, Mike, and thank you.
You bet.
Yes.
The old saying is you get what you elect. And so if folks want to protect their public land, they need to elect these.
I think that's exactly right. And thank you both very much. This has, I think, been really successful.